400 years ago, England was in the throes of social and political upheaval. The plague was ravaging London, the gunpowder plot threatened Parliament, and religious factions were fighting for the hearts and minds of the people. How did the new monarch, James I, respond to this unrest? Amazingly, he appointed a committee. And he charged that the committee produce a new translation of the Bible, the one we know today as the King James translation. How did this committee carry out its work? How was its version of the Bible received in 1611? And what was the impact of this translation project over the past 400 years? Here to discuss these questions is Adam Nicolson, author of God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible. Nicolson is the grandson of Vita Sackville West and Harold Nicolson. After graduating from Magdalen College at Cambridge, he became an award-winning travel writer. His books include Frontiers, Wetland Life in the Somerset Levels, and Sea Room. He is currently a columnist for the London Daily Telegraph and is writing a book on the Atlantic seaboard of the British Isles. Welcome, Adam Nicolson.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. I don't think I've ever stood in a more splendid set of circumstances than these. It makes one feel like a Jacobean preacher. Not that I am one, as you will have gathered from that list of my appallingly variegated career so far. I am not someone who ever studied theology at school or college. I am a journalist, really, and a travel writer. And the book I've written about the King James Bible is really the sort of book I think a travel writer would have written if they'd been parachuted back into early 17th century England. I arrived in this extraordinary world, and really the book says how very, very weird they are. They are very, very unlike us. But I know that I'm only going to talk to you for 15 minutes this evening, and then I hope we're going to have a discussion. So very briefly, the King James Bible is, I think, a real conundrum. It's a very, very odd, anomalous thing. That it is, I think, the most famous book ever written in English. Something like 5 billion copies of it have been sold in the 400 years. It is pretty well exactly 400 years ago today that it was commissioned, in fact. But it's an authorless book, unless you think it's written by God. The people who did the translation, the 50 or so scholars who were commissioned by King James and his Archbishop, were pretty well unheard of at the time and are certainly unheard of now. And it is very, very odd, I think, in our culture, which values the individual expression of individuality, to find that this incredibly dominant book for a long time does not express any form of individuality at all. In fact, in some ways, it's an expression of the suppression of individuality. God's Secretaries is a phrase of Calvin's, amanuensis Dei, which he used to describe not only the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles, but anyone who attempted the idea of translating Bible texts. They should think of themselves as secretaries of God. And what that means in the sort of 16th and 17th century context is to deny themselves authorship, to deny themselves any sense that they had anything whatsoever to contribute themselves, and that their only validity in the task is to transmit the will of the higher power, essentially. Well, in this case, God as the author of the scriptures, or secretary, of course, is a word that is used in 17th century England for the highest officers of state, that King James's first minister, Robert Cecil, was called simply Mr. Secretary. Easily the most powerful man in England, with a good claim, in fact, to be the most corrupt as well, would nevertheless prided himself on that title. Secretary is both the most submissive and the most honourable of terms. And I think that that sort of political niche, if you like, in divine terms, is where these translators can be sort of located. And I think this also is a very odd idea, that the greatest book that has probably moved more English-speaking people than any other is profoundly political. It is not an effusion of sort of inspired religious thinking. It is very acutely positioned by James and Cecil and Richard Bancroft, who is a central figure in the story, who was Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and really the central organizer of the task. But I'll come on to him, but just to sort of describe the political circumstances of the time. James, as you will know, had been King of Scotland for 40 years, since he was a baby, longing to become King of England. Scotland, poor, desperate, a troubled place with violent gangs of Scottish grandees who kidnapped and held James to ransom when he was a child, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a particularly brutal form of Presbyterian church, who kicked him from one end of Scotland to another. And James, I think, learnt when he was a teenage king to hide in some ways, and to come to believe in what I think we would call big tent politics, a kind of politics which would embrace a kind of central moderate opinion and exclude and marginalise the sort of maniacs on either side. And so when he came to England in 1603 on the death of Elizabeth, it was perfectly clear that what he needed to do was re-establish a kind of central big tent in English political and religious life, excluding both the wild, marginalised Catholics who would eventually attempt to blow him up in the gunpowder plot, and also the wild, marginal Puritan separatists, who are, of course, the ancestors of the Americans. And so it's very graceful to laugh at that. So the King James Bible is really the instrument of and the document of that central big tent that James wants to establish in English culture. And its method this is another, I think, very interesting thing about this book. Its method to gain that political end is rhetorical. It uses literary means to achieve sort of political consensus politics. And the way it does that is to embrace as much of the divergent trends and themes in English cultural life, which Thomas addressed a minute or two ago. England, at the end of the sort of long turmoil of the 16th century, really had two big currents running in it. One you could label Puritan, interest in clarity, in the well-being of the individual conscience, in a kind of impatience with old hierarchical structures of church and state, a sense that the self could connect absolutely directly to God via the Word of God, as a sort of intravenous God mechanism. And on the other hand, a fascination with, an obsession with richness and hierarchy and majesty and elaboration and a kind of thickness to glory, if you like. You know, it was a time when England was burgeoning in a commercial and cultural way. The English, for the first time in the early 17th century, were starting to think of themselves as global players, as a culture which could both exploit the world and draw the world into it. And so England was overflowing with a sense of newness and a sort of mercurial possibility of change. It was anxious about that at the same time, interestingly. But so if for example, the English imported the first Chinese porcelain, which they were at the time, it wasn't simply good enough to have china bowls sitting on your table. Get them to London and dress them in highly elaborate gilded frames so that your richness was enriched. There are many more examples of that. But I think that the interesting rhetorical method of the King James Bible is to try and meld these utterly contradictory streams of cultural streams, to try and make clarity, directness, obviousness, a sort of focus on every man, somehow become part or identified with a kind of majestic, kingly, elevated, enriched sense of what was good and beautiful. And I think that, deeply unlikely as this sounds, the King James Bible actually manages to bring about that marriage of contradictions, which is, I think, at the heart of why this particular version of the great Christian holy text has survived and continues to appeal, because it satisfies these two polar needs. King Lear is its exact contemporary, and King Lear addresses exactly the same questions of the competing claims of simplicity and openness and directness, or of grandeur, majesty, and kingliness. And King Lear addresses them by demonstrating what happens when that world falls apart, when all the bonds of society and meaning disintegrate. And the King James Bible addresses the same issues by bringing all those things together into one amazing fabric. That King Lear is a sort of nightmare of dissolution, and the King James Bible is King James's political dream of coherence. Have I gone on too long already? I'll just say one other thing. You will know that T.S. Eliot, famously wrote in an essay in the 1920s about the disaster that happened to probably English-speaking consciousness in the 17th century, the disaster which he called the dissociation of sensibility. That at some time, and he blames Milton and Dryden for this, but at some time in the 17th century, a frame of mind which had existed in the early 17th century, which somehow was able to unify in a single fabric emotional, spiritual, and intellectual ways of being. At some time in the 17th century, that close association of things fell apart, and a sense that feeling on the one hand was different from rationality on the other, or from spirituality in the third way. And I think that one of the reasons that the King James Bible continues to be the incredibly potent text that it is because it comes just at the last minute where sensibility remains undisassociated. It is absolutely at the peak moment in English-speaking culture where those emotional, spiritual, intellectual elements of the human way of mind or a human condition remain one. And I think in verse after verse and chapter after chapter of this translation, you can feel those things working and being together. I've said enough now. So.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Adam Nicolson discussing God's Secretaries. I would like to pick up just exactly where you left off. In your book, and thank you for this delightful book, which seems equally about England at the beginning of the 17th century and the King James Version, which we are all interested in. You make these interesting comments in your book that there's something about the text of the Bible, the King James translation, that evokes a certain response in people that I think the words you use are mystery, a sense of the other, something like this. I take it this also relates to what you've just said about the fact that it comes at a time in 1611 just before the falling apart of the center of the culture, when mind and spirit are still very much together. And another interesting thing you say about the Bible is that this translation is that it's really an oral piece of literature. It's meant to be heard, and the people who were translating actually understood that very, very well, and they had a certain sensibility themselves about listening rather than thinking, as a linguist might, about what they were translating. And I'm just wondering how this all fits together, that they had the genius at that time to put together a translation that people could hear and find meaning in, and that we can still find meaning in. I have to say that as a minister myself, when I talk to people about readings from the Bible, they often ask me, please, to use the King James translation, and so I know whereof you're speaking.
Well, there's a lot in that.
Yes.
I mean, I think that I'm going to just remind me what the points are again quickly. What was your first one?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that this comes at a moment when reason and spirit are just about to fall apart.
Yes.
And yet it's a text that holds things together, that you find in it the fact that the text actually has a certain luminousness about it.
Well, okay, and you went on to say that it was an oral thing. I think this
Yes.
is very important, that the editorial process that was conducted at various levels in the making of this was clearly done not on paper, that any suggested reading was made to the committees, spoken out loud, and they judged whether it was any good by hearing it, as you say. Now, I think that, one interesting way of looking at this question of the sort of coherence of the language is to judge what people did afterwards. And in a way, let me just take this here. If you take, for example, Psalm 8, a very famous psalm, in 1611, the Jacobean translators wrote, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour." Now I think that is beautiful, partly because the actual language it uses is very, very simple. There is no word there which is in itself inaccessible. It is an utterly sort of calm, sort of pure vocabulary. But it is set in a very majestic rhythm. The music of it is big and slow. And I think that is one of the key methods of the translation. It is extremely concrete, and yet in its concreteness is reaching huge metaphysical heights, a kind of majesty that is mindful of man. In some ways, what it says is also the way it says it. Now, Milton, the great sort of wicked player for T.S. Eliot in this, also translated this psalm in the 1640s. And he wrote, "When I behold thy heavens, thy fingers' art, the moon and stars which thou so bright hast set in the pure firmament, then saith my heart, O what is man that thou rememberest yet, and think'st upon him, or of man begot, that him thou visitest, and of him art found. Scarce to be less than gods thou madest his lot, with honour and with state thou hast him crowned." Now, obviously, Milton is having to accommodate rhyme and quite a tense stanza structure in that. But something is missing from that, which was not missing in the 1611 version. And I think what is missing is a kind of a simplicity that somehow by Milton, as he reaches for more, gets less. And the very fact that the King James translators are keeping it down and low actually allows them to achieve heights which, after this breakup, this putative breakup of sensibility, you can never really be got again. I don't know if that answers it.
I'm going to continue this discussion just one more time because as you've been talking, it becomes more interesting. One of the things you say in your book is that, in fact, in the 18th and 19th centuries, this book also became a beloved book in America. Now, America wasn't going through exactly the same cultural situation as England, and yet this book became very beloved to Americans. And so I'm wondering if that doesn't suggest there's not just the context, but there's something about the text in itself that has a certain quality and character. You've just suggested certain literary usages like slowness of speech. And you say in the book they sometimes accomplish that by commas and semicolons and colons at key places. But is there anything else you think that you can see in the text that might be responsible for people's feeling so much love for this text? And, you know, sometimes with this book, people say the reason people like King James is they grew up with it. Mm-hmm. But I think that what we're saying here is that that may not be all there is to it. There may be something to the actual translation.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting question. And, I mean, I think one of the things that you could say about that is that it is an extremely generous book. The intention behind it and the immense care devoted to getting it right is one that wants to give the reader everything. It really does not want to deny the reader at all, or to make life difficult for the reader. And it does that on both these levels. It aims for complete comprehensibility, so you don't feel threatened by it. But it also aims to give you scale, grandeur, majesty, divinity. It aims to give you both. And I think that That is certainly one reason. The history of the King James Bible in America is very interesting, in that when the first Americans arrived in the 1620s and 30s, they did not bring the King James Bible with them. The King James Bible was the Bible of the dreadful world that needed to be left behind. They brought with them an earlier English Bible called the Geneva Bible, which is anti-monarchical and always translates king as tyrant, for example. But then something interesting happens in America, in that, and interestingly parallel to England, in that through the 17th century, because the Geneva Bible was also the most popular Bible in England to start with, through the 17th century, the King James Bible starts to become the Bible for Americans. And why should that be? Why should the Americans start to lose their affection for a Bible like the Geneva Bible, which is all about the individual's relationship to God? It is a Bible to be read with footnotes and tips for the private reader, and instead move towards this other sort of musical, sonorous thing. And I don't know the answer in America. The answer in England is that after the terrible disruption of the Civil War, a really terrible war, fought around these issues in some ways, it was a war between purity and majesty, the King James Bible, with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, starts to look like a place of consolation. It is a part of the culture which is still there, still speaking, and is speaking from before the great rupture. It is a place in which you can feel at home, and it's consciously archaic, and even archaic language. Even at the time, it was even in 1611, it was pretty old-fashioned. Looks paternal. And I think that there is something paternal about the loving generosity of this text. I don't know if that works in America or not, whether that's true here or not.
You are listening to Adam Nicolson discussing God's Secretaries. The floor will now be open for audience questions. If you have a question, we ask you please to come line up at the microphone here at the center aisle, and to remember, please, if you can, to limit your questions to one.
That's so unfair.
I want to go back to the context a little bit of the other Bibles that were available. You mentioned the Geneva Bible and the fact that it translated the word king as tyrant. There was also the Tyndale Bible, the Douay Bible, and of course you had the Geneva Bible during the previous century. And I'd like to get a sense of what was going on in the king's mind, the committee's mind, as to why they needed this Bible. Certainly after the fact, they came up with this consoling Bible that, as you said, during the Restoration, it worked very well. But what was going on during that time period that it need to supplant these other Bibles?
Well, when James arrives on the English throne in 1603, England really has two Bibles and two Bible traditions. The first, as you say, derives from William Tyndale, the great Protestant martyr of the 1530s. Basically, the Tyndale Bible reaches its finest flowering in the Geneva Bible of the 1560s. Clear, direct, accessible to the common man, for the ploughboy, as Tyndale said, but not a Bible that could be in any way approved of by the royal establishment, and so popular but unpolitic. The other tradition is the sort of state tradition begun by Henry VIII, a couple of Bibles that he had produced, which then has its sort of final Elizabethan flowering in a Bible called the Bishop's Bible, produced in 1568, with portraits of Elizabeth and her ministers, Walsingham and Burghley, on the front page of it, totally sort of state Bible, deeply unloved, very clumsy, a dreadful translation, one of the worst that's ever been made in English. Famously, it translated the phrase, cast thy bread upon the waters as lay thy bread upon wet faces. And so the English hated it. So you can see you have a problem. And boldly stated, the King James Bible aims to solve the problem and do that. Is that enough of an answer?
Are you suggesting that it's more stylistic than political?
No, I think the essential point is that style is political. And because it's a translation, you can't make things up. All you can do is spin it. This is a spin story.
Would you comment on the different sources that were used for this particular translation? Were they just sources in English or other languages?
No, the scholars were very good for the time at the ancient languages. And Lancelot Andrews, the leading translator, it was said, could speak 6 ancient and 15 modern languages. And there were lots of other Arabic scholars involved. They could speak Aramaic and so on. So their language skills were pretty good for the time. They're not as good as they should have been, or as they now are. They couldn't apparently, I am no scholar myself, but I gather that they couldn't really understand the way in which Hebrew tenses work, for example, and they couldn't understand the kind of Greek that the New Testament is written in. It's not your pure classical Aristotelian Greek. It's a very much more sort of street Greek. Koine is called. A sort of slum Greek almost, really rough language. And they couldn't speak it. They couldn't quite get it. And so there are definite mistranslations in the King James Bible. There's a whole layer of getting it wrong. And below that, there's another layer in that the actual texts they had of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures weren't the best ones. Even by the standards of the time, they weren't as good as some of the texts that the Calvinists in Geneva had been using. And so there is, the 19th century discovered much purer and earlier texts. And so there's a sort of double failing in it, purely as a work of scholarship, if you're going to judge it by modern standards. Does that invalidate it? I would say it doesn't, for the reasons that we've been talking about, in that it is a sacred text in English now, and I think it works as a sacred text in English, even though it doesn't actually transmit every piece of information that it should, which is a slightly difficult area.
It sounds right.
Well, if it's the Word of God, as they knew it to be, then that makes things difficult. Yes, sir.
Yes, actually, I was going to ask a more general question, but sort of touching on what you just said, let me clarify this first. You say that the Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek texts that they had available to them at that time were not really the best even for that day. I was under the impression that they had used Erasmus's, received text, the Greek text that he had come up with, actually translated while he was visiting Sir Thomas More in England, ironically enough, like about 100 years before. Did they use that text?
They did. This famous Textus Receptus.
The Textus Receptus, yeah.
But I am not a Bible scholar, but I understand that 19th century scholarship discovered other manuscripts which are clearly earlier and visibly less corrupt than the Textus Receptus. And I mean, as you will know, that there is a group of people called the King James Onlyists in this country who claim that because God directed the Jacobean translators to use the Textus Receptus, and that is the version of the Bible which has been most widely disseminated, then clearly the Textus Receptus is the correct text. Which is a very...
So in other words, a received text is almost like a revealed text.
What?
the text is, the received text is almost like literally received from the clouds almost. It's almost like kind of the
and that God would
text.
not be so stupid as to make the most widely disseminated Bible based on the wrong text, would he? What's the answer to that? It's quite a difficult question, actually.
My main question, which sort of segues from that, is just if you could just go into a little bit more detail as to the kind of, I know we probably don't, as you said earlier, we don't know a lot about of the details about a lot of these 40 or 50 some scholars, but just a little bit more detailed as to the kind of credentials such that they were at the time. And particularly, I remember hearing somewhere that the King James Bible was the first Bible, perhaps the first translation in history, but at least the first in the English tradition, to use Jewish scholars, or to have like an actual Jewish scholar on the board, so to speak. And I just wanted to know if you could clarify that.
I don't think there is a Jewish scholar. Thinking of it, I don't think there is one. The way it was organised was that Archbishop Bancroft divided the Bible into 6 parts, 3 Old and 3 New Testament, allocated each of those parts to a subcommittee, 2 in Oxford, 2 in Cambridge, and 2 in Westminster. And each of the subcommittees was given a director, and the directors were very clearly political clients of Cecil, and absolutely central players in the Jacobean church establishment. Some, quote, Puritans were included on the committees, but moderate Puritans, and wherever a Puritan was included on a committee, he was heavily outnumbered by much more kind of centrally committed Jacobean, what would be called Arminian scholars. So it is a fix. Needless to say, it's a complete fix that it looks like it is embracing large sections of English church political opinion, but actually it is well enough organised in the way of these things to be sure of what the answer that would come out would be in the end. So as to their scholarly credentials, well, they were very great. I mean, there were, these were the leading scholars in England who had been drenched in biblical and linguistic scholarship. I talk about some of the libraries of some of the individual scholars which survive in Cambridge. There's one, and you can read, you can know his mind from his reading, and it is enormously wide. There's certainly no hesitation about reading a lot of Jesuit scholarship, for example. There are correspondence with Jesuit cardinals in France. One of the scholars, Henry Saville, sends a rich man, a provost of Eton College, sent out agents to scour the Eastern Mediterranean for original manuscripts. I mean, it was a proper, serious enterprise. It was not like the Bishop's Bible, done in a sort of terrible hurry. This was to be the definitive thing.
In my younger days, I would go to the library and I'd read about the Bible and how it come about. And I can remember in 1611, now when I went to the store to buy a Bible, I didn't know whether I wanted one said Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. And so the scripture here in Acts 10:38 says how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Ghost and with power, who went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil, for God was with him. So I chose the King James Version. I chose the right Bible for me. And then these days here, as we're going along, there's so much controversy over Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, but I did choose the right Bible.
I'm very glad to hear that. I don't think there is much of a distinction in my mind between spirit and ghost, but that may be more about me than anything else.
You have said that you're not a biblical scholar, but perhaps you can help me a little bit with this question that was brought up by some of what you were just saying. As far as is known today, which are the considered by scholars, if you will, to be the closest thing to more accurate texts, if you will, or if you want to talk about in what sense they're understood to be more accurate. And if there are several, is there an edition out there that is an English translation or an attempt at an English translation of one of these more recent, supposedly more accurate texts? And I'm partly interested, just if one wanted to sit down with a copy of the King James Bible, because you talked about how there were these layers, and it'd be interesting, if you wanted to, it'd be interesting to hear what that layer of alleged mistranslation is all about, and what might turn up if we had a supposedly more accurate text.
You're right. I'm not going to be able to give any good answer to that. But I mean, I found extraordinarily helpful when I was writing this book, Christian websites, which do give you probably 15 or 20 different translations side by side of any verse chapter you want to find. And so just on a pure comparative basis, that is interesting. The whole drive in the 19th century to sort of get things right did a lot to revise the King James Bible, and a lot of the revised versions of the late 19th century are, I'm told, said to be very good on a kind of scholarly basis. But my natural instinct is to sidestep this question and to say that what matters about a religious text is not actually its information, not even its accuracy. It's about whether it addresses the beauty of holiness. And that's what the King James Bible does do.
I'm reminded of a class that Northrop Frye taught here at Harvard, where he said that he compared the scientific truth, the truth of correspondence versus and he taught the Bible, and versus the truth of coherence, which is the poetic truth, like similar to what I think you're alluding to.
And that is what I mean.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You mentioned Lear. Could there be anything in Kipling's charming fantasy of Shakespeare being surreptitiously hired as a consultant?
I love that story. Proof of Holy Writ. Yes, so for those of you who don't know this story, it is absolutely hilarious. That it's a scene in a pub in London in about 1607, something like that, and our Will and Ben Jonson, his best friend, are getting drunk together and joshing each other about how good or bad their plays are, when a man from a horse bursts in and says, "I've just come from the translating committee and we don't know what to do, we're tearing our hair out. Mr. Shakespeare, surely you could do it, can't you?" And Will Shakespeare says, "Yeah, what is it that you want?" And said, "Well, we're just struggling with the Nunc Dimittis at the moment." And so, I can't remember what it is, something like that. And so Will strolls up and down the garden of the pub, saying whatever the words of the Nunc Dimittis are, just spouting them phrase by phrase. I'm really sorry to say that is not a likely scenario. Will Shakespeare, sort of bisexual, capitalist, sort of mad, sort of degenerate playwright actor figure, crypto-Catholic, is pretty unlikely to have been brought on board, I think, by this sort of, spin machine that Bancroft was running. So, sad to say. I love the story, though. I live within a mile of Kipling's house. Yes.
I'd like to suggest an answer to your question about the penetration of the King James Version in America. And it is actually its feminine appeal, because I think that when in the settlers' cabins you found the Bible, and you found women reading the Bible to their children. And you can see this reflected, I think, in the folk music and in the country and western music up until the 1950s and 60s. There's a richness of the language that comes unmistakably from the King James Version of the Bible. But my question actually goes more toward the facetious Shakespeare involvement, and that is a connection between the King James Version and the Book of Common Prayer. To an American ear, untrained as it may be, they sound as if they're written by the same people, and the style is unmistakably similar. So maybe Shakespeare got involved there.
Well, the Book of Common Prayer is earlier. It's from the 1540s. And there is a distinction, but it's mild, I think, because in some ways the Book of Common Prayer set the template for that a lot of the Jacobeans were working to. And if there is a difference, I think that Jacobean English is sort of fatter, richer, and fuller, slightly. And the Book of Common Prayer has a kind of slightly more stripped quality to it. And I think that is to do with the political intentions of the Jacobean establishment to elide kingliness and godliness. That James himself said, "Can't you see that I have sparkles of the divinity about me?" As if he was wearing a sort of sequin dress of godliness somehow. He said that in Parliament. And I think that no one in the mid-16th century would have started talking in that way.
Yeah, I wonder if you can say more about the political context. That I get the impression from what I've heard tonight that there was some political motivation in the King James Version. And I think, for example, I'm not a historian, but I wondered if it was an anti-Reformationist element in the sense that I gather from what I heard tonight, the Geneva translation probably was more Reformationist. It was more individualist empowerment, the kind of thing that Luther had in mind, and maybe what King James wanted to do, and maybe he was, I presume that was the beginning of the Anglican Church, maybe he was beginning to go back to a kind of Catholicism with him as the Pope, and that this translation, beautiful as it might be, might have been an effort to at least harness or reverse the Reformation. And in the same context, it occurs to me that the 30 Years' War started a few years later. I don't know if it had anything to do with this. Could you talk about the political context?
Yeah, I think that's right. The trouble is that if you are a king of a Protestant country in the early 17th century, and you feel this kind of river of the Reformation running underneath you, the political implications of that, perfectly clear at the time, are that are Republican or democratic. I mean, they are non-kingly. That if there is going to be a direct connection from each believer to God, then there is essentially no need for a church. A church is an irrelevance. Because what is all this elaborate, expensive, exploitative structure? And in England, uniquely, the crown sits in the heart of the church. And so any king interested in maintaining his position as king is going to need to buttress the church. And that, I think, that's the central political motivation. And that if you continue to allow your people to use a Bible every day, which erodes the standing of the crown in relationship, in contrast to their immensely a sort of high electricity relationship from them to God, and the crown becomes increasingly irrelevant, you're going to act against that. And there are lots of things happening in early 17th century England which, in the court culture, show a sort of increasing understanding of that for the crown to survive at all, it has to make itself or dress itself in the robes of the divine, essentially. I mean, there's a much longer answer to that. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate even more on the process that these committees were formed and how this was written. I find it staggering that you could put together 40 or 50 people and ultimately have there be agreement upon anything, much less a book of this magnitude. And I'm curious, how involved was King James in this process, and who at those stages of saying yes or no, this is good enough, had the final say?
The reason the committee worked was that it was very tightly organised by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his rules survive. It's one of the few documents that survive, his rules for the translators. And so he divides the committee up into these 6 that are distributed across the Bible and across England, each with a very acute bit of political control on each subcommittee. And then each member of each subcommittee is told to go away and translate the entire section of the Bible that is the responsibility of that subcommittee themselves in private. So you get 8 or 9 new translations. So the mouth of the net is sort of hugely wide, drawing on what the time can provide in a way. So you're not sort of going with a narrow tool to start with, you're sucking it in. Then each of those people brings their suggestions to the meeting of the committee, and the committee as a whole orally decides on what they think the best is. Now, within each committee, there are clearly 2, maybe, or 3 heavy-hitting power players, and there is a sort of base of dogs' bodies who are doing the hard work. You can see that just in social standing. There are big guys and small guys, and it's never said anywhere, but I imagine, given how people are, that dogs' bodies produce, and big hitters decide. And the big hitters are apparatchiks. They're in the system. They're doing what the establishment requires. And so each subcommittee then submits its agreed text. And there is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there is a document which shows that actually at work, that you can see where an individual has suggested something, where the committee has revised it, and what the final outcome is. And I talk about that in the book. And it's very interesting to see exactly how they do it. It's a fine and detailed process. It's one of our assumptions that anything political is somehow crass. But it's part, I think, of the non-dissociation of sensibility, that the intensely political can be the very fine at this moment. So then, when they submit that to an overall revising committee, they read through the whole thing again, everybody listens to it, they compare it against all previous English translations. That then gets submitted to a final committee of bishops. That then nominally, anyway, goes to the king. Did James have anything to do with it? It's impossible to say. He clearly he started the process. There are some letters early on saying he wants to get on with it. There are some letters in the middle saying he really wants to see some results, guys. Come, produce something, please. There's a letter at the end in which someone complains he hasn't paid them enough. But then he does. And it's called the King James Bible. I think it is the King James Bible. I think that people have in the past denied that it is because they can't bear the idea that a sort of louche, drunk, sort of chronically in love with beautiful young man could be responsible for a thing like this. But I think that too is another symptom of this unified world.
Well, I've been chased around the countryside by Presbyterians too, so that got me thinking. I just, when it comes to the King James Bible, the first thought that I have is in John, it says, there's a light in the darkness, but the darkness can't comprehend the light. And I know that is really pretty simple, but it's probably it does things like beg the question, it gives the answer, and you can go anywhere with it. And
what, on the word comprehend, you mean? Comprehend is the tricky word.
What is
there,
the
isn't
light?
it?
What is the darkness exactly? And how far do you want to go with that? And comprehension, absolutely. I mean, the mortal trying to understand God is the light, life itself. Who did write so you could take that to the point where God wrote everything. So going back to what you were talking about early on. So that's the one line that just holds that Bible in between my ears. So I just thought what you might think of that. Is that too simplistic, or is that...
Well, if I grasp what you mean, well, I mean, I don't know how to respond to that. I mean, you could say that ambiguity is almost a necessary element in discussing the undiscussable. That any attempt to be cut and dried is bound to be flawed. And to allow meaning to sort of hang in a state of uncertainty, which a verse like that does, is maybe the best we can do.
Thank you.
It's been said that the Geneva Bible was controversial for its footnotes, and you say that after the Restoration you start to see this point where you start to see the King James Bible showing up more and more. You also point out in the book that Lancelot Andrews and the other members of the committees still did their work from the Geneva Bible.
Yeah.
Is there a point sometime around the Restoration where you can actually say you start seeing the King James showing up in the pulpits of the various churches, or is this a gradual thing over time?
Well, one of the things that James himself did was to ban the Geneva Bible. That not immediately, because I think the assumption was that the new King James Bible would take over. But in 1615, he banned the Geneva Bible. And so, of course, what happened was that huge numbers of Geneva Bibles were then imported from Holland, all stamped with the date 1610. So it's a nightmare for bibliophiles that every single edition of the Geneva Bible from 1615 to 1650 bears the date 1610. I think that there is... Well, I think what I said earlier remains true, that the Restoration genuinely wanted a kind of Bible that was like the King James Bible. And that was the sort of voice that they wanted to hear God speaking in. They did not want clarified individual relationship with the divine. They wanted the warm embrace of cultural richness. And I think that you can see in some ways the whole development of the English church in the 18th century towards a sort of easy, rather slack, tolerant complacency, sort of fat complacency, in which all that frantic energy of the 17th century religious experience had really dissipated. You could see that as one of the sort of legacies of the King James Bible, that it is a comfort zone, not a zone of sort of agony.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you, Adam Nicolson. You have been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum, for a CD of this program entitled God's Secretaries, recorded in May 2004. Send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, or call 617-495-2727, or visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Thomas Nicolson. Thank you for joining us this evening.